Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with Amanda Montell about the Age of Magical Overthinking, Notes on Modern Irrationality. In the book, she explains how in this modern information age, our brain's coping mechanisms have been overloaded and why we respond in irrational ways. Hi, I'm Dan Scunner, and this is Some Books Considered. A bit about the author. Amanda Montell is a writer and linguist from Baltimore. Her previous books include the bestselling Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism, and Wordslut, a feminist guide to taking back the English language. Her writing has also appeared in the New York Times, Marie Claire, and Cosmopolitan, to name a few. Amanda, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, this is a fascinating book, and there's so much in here. Obviously, we're not going to cover it all in this brief interview, so give us a quick overview. What are readers going to find here?
Absolutely. So The Age of Magical Overthinking, Notes on Modern Irrationality, is about cognitive biases in the information age. So every chapter of the book is dedicated to a different cognitive bias. Some of the more famous ones include confirmation bias, sunk cost fallacy, but there are lots of others with these interesting names like the IKEA effect or the halo effect. And I use each of these biases as a lens to explore some mysterious irrationality plaguing the broader zeitgeist and my own life, from celebrity worship to weaponized nostalgia to our cultural embrace of Instagram manifestation gurus.
Now, many of these phenomena have existed for many years, but you just think they've been exacerbated by this information overload now?
Absolutely. So human beings have been relying on cognitive biases to make decisions since the dawn of human decision-making. The mind is not perfectly rational, but rather what a behavioral economist might call resource rational. We are primed to make the best decisions that we can with our limited time and cognitive resources and memory storage. Cognitive biases used to help us make sense of the world enough to survive it, but now the daily problems that we're tasked to confront are simply more abstract and complex and disembodied than the world was when we developed these psychological shortcuts. And so I'm finding that this combination of our innate superstitions and magical thinking with information overload and mass loneliness and a sort of capitalistic pressure to know everything under the sun has been really painful for us. But it's that way without our realizing it. And so those were some of the ideas I hope to explore in the book.
And you use contemporary examples to explain this. For example, in regard to the halo effect, you talk about Taylor Swift and all those Swifties out there.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So the halo effect is the first bias that I tackle in the book. It describes our tendency to admire one quality in a person and jump to the conclusion that they must be perfect overall. So we enjoy a pop star's music. We jump to the conclusion that they must also be worldly, nurturing, that perhaps they care about us as much as we care about them, that maybe they align politically with our values. Or say we like an influencer's sense of style. We might assume that they're also cultured and educated and up to date on current events, the way that they're up to date on fashion trends. And this sort of conclusion jumping that we do about figures that we admire has a kind of evolutionary backstory. There was once a time in human history when you would notice someone in your community with big muscles or intact teeth, and you might jump to the conclusion that that person was a skilled fighter or had avoided disfigurement from battle and was thus, a good hunter and a good fighter and someone that would be good to align with for survival purposes. But we're now mapping this halo effect onto modern parasocial relationships, and that's really setting up both the fan and the subject of their admiration for psychological failure, and it's causing so many of the cycles of intense celebrity worship and dethronement that we're seeing in our society these days.
And in terms of being aware of these things, does that help us sort of navigate that and realize, oh, this is why I become such a big fan, and maybe I need to, moderate my expectations about that person?
Yeah, I find that for many of the biases that I cover in the book, awareness is really helpful to, mitigate some of that, quick decision making that you might jump to that might not lead to the most productive outcome or the most healing outcome if you're really prioritizing your mental well-being. There are a few biases where even awareness will not help you. There is a bias that I cover in the book called the illusory truth effect, which describes our proclivity to think that something is true just because we've heard it multiple times. It's the power of repetition to make something sound accurate. And this is something that we find in political dogmas or the spread of mis and disinformation online. But it's such an incredibly powerful bias that even, becoming aware of it will not help you overcome it. And yet there are still ways to take advantage of what we know about the illusory truth effect to help spread actually accurate information. So there's a sort of slightly different approach to each of these biases in order to, quell the negative side effects.
Another one of the biases you talk about, as you mentioned before, is this confirmation bias. Explain to us how that works. And one of the examples you give is astrology.
Yes. Well, confirmation bias was the first cognitive bias that I was ever aware of. It's the one that gets the most airtime, when talking about politics or information processing. And it describes our penchant to selectively seek out, notice and remember information which validates our existing beliefs while ignoring, dismissing, forgetting information that controverts those beliefs. And this definitely shows up in astrology. I sort of gently poke fun at the culture of my community in Los Angeles, which really embraces astrology as a belief system, but more so kind of a framework to understand certain points in your life, certain occasions that might be painful that you can notice in various people's lives, like the Saturn return is supposed to be this, moment of reckoning that happens around the age of 29. And it's kind of irrational and doesn't really apply based on any form of fact, but it is a nice way to sort of process transition periods in your life. Anyway, when we read our horoscopes or when we speak about our charts, astrology with other people, we tend to, cherry pick the evidence that validates our existing belief that astrology is real and that, our personality and our identity makes sense. There's some cosmic logic for why we behave the ways that we do. And I think in a lot of ways that's relatively harmless. But when this confirmation bias is taken to a dogmatic place, when it's weaponized by public figures and politicians who are in charge of policymaking or mass disseminating really damaging beliefs, it's really dangerous because it's taking advantage of a bias that is so deeply ingrained in us and something that really helps us. I mean, if we didn't have any confirmation bias at all, we would agonize over every daily life choice. Should I have gotten the salad or the soup? Should I have spent more time with my grandparents? It really helps us justify our behaviors and our worldview to ourselves. And that can be really efficient, but also really complicated and potentially destructive in our ever complicating world.
I'm talking with Amanda Montell about the Age of Magical Overthinking, notes on modern irrationality. And our conversation continues in a moment. If you're getting value out of this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you'll know when I post new interviews. And thank you. Because the world is so complicated, people are looking for answers. They want to understand. And what kind of biases come into play when we see things like conspiracy theories flourishing? Because they do provide answers, they're just not the right answers.
Right. Great question. So there's a really fascinating bias that I tackle in the book called proportionality bias, which describes our tendency to believe that big events or even just big feelings must have had a big cause. So this underlies so much pernicious conspiratorial thinking. A global pandemic strikes. It's such an overwhelming calamity. We think, or some of us think, this couldn't have been caused by a bunch of random small misfortunes. The government must have engineered it on purpose. That's the only way this makes astral sense. Or another example would be, Princess Diana passed away. This could not have been some out of the blue accident. the royal family must have killed her, or the British government must have killed her. It's the only way that this makes proportional sense. I will never get over the irony that human beings are the only species that makes up fictions, mythologizes the world as an attempt to make sense of it. And so during times of incredible unpredictability, anguish, tumult, we tend to come up with these stories, these misattributions of cause and effect to understand why something so huge and so painful is happening to us. But proportionality bias doesn't just explain these more, outrageous conspiracy theories. It also underlies a lot of more seemingly innocent behaviors. In the book, I write about how ideas of manifestation are, in a way, a conspiracy theory of their own. They have a positive spin, but the idea is that by, vision boarding or by bathing your crystals or applying the law of attraction perfectly, or by signing up for this TikTok manifestation guru's course and following their bespoke method for making your dreams come true, that you can yield wealth and success and love. And if you don't manifest correctly, well, surely that's not the result of systemic issues or small misfortunes, but it's really your fault. Like you are in dogmatic absolutist control of your own destiny. And we really embrace those ideas when the world feels unpredictable, because it helps restore some agency. But there are definitely downsides to these gross misattributions of cause and effect. There is like a positive and a negative side to basically every bias that I cover in the book.
One of them is nostalgia. And in some ways, engaging in nostalgia is fine. You remember things from your youth, etc. But it also can be weaponized. And we see that a lot today, where it seems like our nation is moving backwards in many ways, trying to seek a nostalgia that maybe did or did not really exist. But it's being used for political reasons and other ways to control and manipulate people.
Yeah. So nostalgia is the sort of affective side of a cognitive bias called declinism, which describes our proclivity to think that life is just getting irreversibly worse and worse and worse, and it's all downhill from here. Human beings are very strange about time. The mind does not perceive the past, present, and future accurately. The future feels really unpredictable and thus scary, and so we tend to procrastinate it. There are studies done that have shown that we actually tend to conceive of our future selves as strangers. And that's why we so often put off saving for retirement, or not doing our homework, or not eating very well, because those future selves are just random nobodies to us. And yet we tend to over glamorize or idealize the past, especially when the present feels painful. I've spoken to nostalgia scholars like Clay Routledge, who has reassured me that a form of nostalgia called personal nostalgia, or sort of sinking into the warm bath of your own personal memories, is actually really healthy. It's a coping mechanism. If we can reflect on better times, even if we're sort of distorting them to seem more positive, that helps us tap into a form of imagination. It helps us envision a better future, a future that could be that romantic or that enjoyable, and it helps us get through the present. But when populist figures, whether they're politicians or even influencers, glamorize a past that never existed, a past we've never known, this is called historical nostalgia. That can be really nefarious, because they can use it to catastrophize the present and sell citizens on a vision of the past that was just like totally made up, as a way to promise a future that probably can't exist either.
Another thing you talk about in the book that I wasn't familiar with, but is interesting to explain some behaviors, and that's the recency illusion. Explain that.
Yeah, the recency illusion is our tendency to think that something is new and thus urgent and worthy of panic just because it's new to us. It's not objectively new, but we've just learned about it, and thus it is worthy of panic and freakouts. So, again, this has an adaptive benefit. There was once a time in human history where if you heard, say, a rustling in the bushes that could potentially be caused by a predator, it didn't matter whether that predator just got there 2 minutes ago or whether it got there 2 days ago, the fact that you are now being alerted to it with this stimulus of the rustling in the bushes is good enough news, is like a good enough piece of information that you should react to it and that you should probably run to save yourself. Even if it's an overreaction, it's worth following that impulse to save your life. But we are now sort of treating these non-urgent threats, which might manifest in the way of a clickbait headline or a seemingly curt email from your boss, as worthy of panic. And so the recency illusion can really explain so much of the painful fight or flight reactivity that we have in response to the news. And of course, there's a civic responsibility to pay attention to the news and remain informed. But media companies are, of course, incentivized to make news entertainment, to make it feel really dramatic, and to engage our fight or flight response, even when the news item is objectively more measured. And so being aware of the recency illusion has really helped me mitigate my personal freakouts in response to headlines.
Well, there's much more in this book we won't have a chance to talk about, but I do want to ask you about one more. And I would also comment that this book is filled with your own stories and anecdotes. It's not just a dry scientific report about these various biases. But one of them you talk about is the IKEA effect, and how at first you thought, no, but you had some personal experience that changed your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. The IKEA effect, adorably named that, describes this bias, which is our tendency to think that something is more valuable because we helped create it. And I told the story of this bias through an experience of my own crafting. I was never particularly good with my hands, beating, sewing, braiding. It was never my thing. But during the pandemic, I discovered the art of flipping furniture, of restoring, old cane chairs and things like that. And suddenly the IKEA effect became very real for me. It really embraced my inner crafter. And while writing that chapter, I really learned how important for the human spirit it is to work with your hands and to engage in DIY practices as sort of a holistic mode of interaction, and how that sort of deep-seated desire in us is being threatened by things like AI art. We, even if delusional, we really value things that we helped create, that we could show to our family members. And so those are some of the ideas that I got to explore in that very fun and personal chapter.
Well, it is a fun book. It's informative. It's educational. And it has a companion podcast, I understand, that you've created to sort of go along with the theme of this book.
Yes, absolutely. So on May 15th, the podcast is going to launch and it will air every other Wednesday. It's called Magical Overthinkers, and it's about the buzzy, confounding subjects we can't stop overthinking about, from narcissism to nostalgia to millennial cringe. There are just so many topics that are proverbially living rent-free in my head these days. And so for that podcast, I got to speak to so many fascinating, charismatic experts, from astrophysicists to philosophers, to help put our overthinking to bed once and for all, or to attempt to.
Well, to learn more, the book is The Age of Magical Overthinking: Notes on Modern Irrationality by Amanda Montell. Amanda, thank you for talking with me today.
It was a pleasure.
Now, if you'd like to purchase The Age of Magical Overthinking, I've placed a link for you in the description below. And if you'd like to see more videos about books and their authors on a wide variety of topics, be sure to subscribe, like, and click on the bell to be notified about future programs. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.